Шановні
Dear colleagues, we continue our working day. The topic of the next event is Remembering the Holocaust and the Future of Europe. Our speaker is Timothy Snyder, American historian. And I give the floor now to Fedeshak Natalia. She is Ukrainian and Jewish encounter participant. So thank you very much for coming today. This is a great honor for us that Mr. Snyder, Professor Snyder, came to us to speak about history of the Holocaust. He is the participant of our special program dedicated to the commemoration of the memory. We told you about our program already. This is the second part, and Professor Snyder took part in our public symposium. And also we had program for students, and we will speak about the contest of architectural ideas to create a necropolis in the Babi Yar. And those people who come to Ukrainian house, they will see that the best examples that are in this hall. So on the 29th, we will have a commemorative concert, and Professor Snyder prepared a very interesting report, and he is going to discuss his main thesis of his report, and he will be ready then to answer your questions. He will speak English. Please.
Доброго дня. Я буду говорити англійською.
Good afternoon. I will speak in English, but if you want to ask questions in Ukrainian or any other language, please welcome.
Just speak for a few minutes about the historical event of Babi Yar, its significance in the Holocaust as a whole, and how we might remember it. I want to emphasize that when I talk about memory, I'm talking about your memory as well as a common memory. And although the facts are there for us to establish them together, it's a national choice how they're remembered. There's only one history, right? But there are many memories. And how we go about building memories is how we go about building nations. So, following this logic, I'm going to start with the facts and end with a few thoughts about how we remember. So, what are the facts? On the 29th and 30th of September 1941, 33,771 Jews, almost all of them Jews from Kiev, were killed outside the city, in a place that was then outside the city, Babi Yar. They were killed by a unit of the German SS, a so-called Einsatzgruppe C. They were killed by 2 units of the German Order Police. They were killed because of the cooperation of these German institutions with other German institutions, the German Civilian Occupation Authority in Kiev, the German Army, the German Wehrmacht. They were killed also with the help of local Kievans who took part, for example, in hanging the signs around Kiev, which demanded that Jews appear at a certain time and place upon penalty of death. So this is what happened. How could something like this happen? In general, historians point to 3 larger causes. The first cause is the war itself. There can't be Babi Yar, there can't be the killing of Ukrainian Jews without a war and without a very special kind of war. The purpose of Hitler's war was to conquer Ukraine. Above all things, the goal of the German war effort was Ukraine. Ukraine played a very special role in Hitler's thinking. When Hitler said Lebensraum, living space, he had in mind, above all, Ukraine. So, although there was a war in Britain, a war in France, a war in the West, for Hitler, the main war was the war against the Soviet Union for Ukraine. And what this meant was the war in the East was fought according to different rules than the war in the West. The war in the West was fought as a more or less normal war. The occupations in the West, with some exceptions, were more or less normal occupations. The war in the East was an unusual war. It was a war of extermination. It was a war of colonization, where the goal was not just to conquer territory, but to colonize peoples, to starve Slavs, to ethnically cleanse Slavs, to deport Slavs, and to create a German colony. Without that idea and without that war, there could not have been Babi Yar. The second reason that most historians would cite would be ideology. The war in the East was a war of colonization. It was a war of ethnic cleansing, deportation, starvation. But the way that Jews were treated was different. In Hitler's ideology, Jews were not just racially inferior, like Ukrainians. In Hitler's ideology, Jews were the people who around the world conspired to make rules that prevented Germany from winning, rules that caused all of anything bad that befell the German nation, whether those rules were Christianity, capitalism, communism. Any set of rules, any set of ethics, any set of laws, Hitler thought, came from the Jews. And so the Jews played a very special role in Hitler's ideology. They had a very special place in his ideology, and this meant that they had to be removed from the face of the earth. The third factor that some historians would cite would be something like lawlessness. In order to kill Jews, Hannah Arendt said a long time ago, in order to kill Jews, they first had to be separated from the law. And one way to understand Hitler's advance, or Germany's advance through Europe, is as the destruction of states. The Austrian state, the Czechoslovak state, the Polish state, and then the attempt to destroy the Soviet state. And with each attempt to destroy a state, from 1938 to 1941, the steps taken against Jews became more radical until we reach the summer of 1941. Third point I want to make is the general meaning of Babi Yar, the centrality of Babi Yar for the Holocaust. For the Germans, Babi Yar, the killing of these almost 34,000 children, women, and men in September 1941, established a method of killing. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, they didn't have a plan, they didn't have a method, they didn't know what the final solution was going to be. But very quickly, within a few weeks, they understood that mass killings of this kind were possible. They did not know that they could do it, and they did not know that local people would help them. By the time they reached the end of September 1941, they have found a model of mass shooting where the Germans are the shooters, but where locals help. And over the course of 1941 and 1942, ever more local people, Soviet citizens, Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians, others, will help. Using this model, the Germans will kill 95% of the Jews who come under their control in the occupied Soviet Union, 95%. They will kill about 2.4 million Jews in this way during the course of the war. So roughly half of the Holocaust will be carried out by shooting over pits, ravines, ditches dug by Jews themselves or by Soviet prisoners of war. And of course, this version of the Holocaust comes first. In the West, and even to some extent here in the East, when we think of the Holocaust, we think of Auschwitz. But Auschwitz comes later. This method of killing is what shows that the Holocaust is possible. The shift from shooting to the gas chambers is a shift of technique, but it's the shooting that showed that a Holocaust was possible. The final point I want to make is about how we choose to remember these events. And let me repeat what I said at the beginning. The historical experience is general. when I at least look at the Holocaust as a historian, I see that the behavior of people, whether it was in France or whether it was in Belarus, whether it was in Greece or whether it was in the Netherlands, is very much the same, and is largely predictable based upon the structures they found themselves in. I do not think that the Holocaust as a history is best understood in terms of Ukrainians or Poles or Belarusians or Russians. I think the Holocaust as a history is a universal one, where all human beings have something to learn. That said, we human beings function in national communities with national educational systems, national museums, and national languages, national habits of communication. And the way that those schools, museums, conversations are formed is in large measure up to us. So when I as an American look at, for example, our Holocaust Museum, and when I'm invited to comment on things, I criticize this or I criticize that because I think there are places where Americans need to be more critical about themselves. Right? Not because I like criticizing people, but because criticism and reflection, I think, is a better way to build a nation than myth-making and fiction. And I believe that applies to everyone generally. It applies to everyone generally, but we have to do it in our own ways, right? We have to do it particularly. With Ukraine, the place that I would start in talking about memory would be with one of the rescuers. We should remember, right? We cannot make a myth of the rescuers in Ukraine or Poland or anyone else. The people who rescued Jews were a small minority, and it's unfair to the historical record to begin with them. However, this small minority can tell us something important because they set out an ideal. It's precisely because there were so few of them that they're so important, right? It's precisely because there's so few of them that they set out an ideal for the rest of us. One of the Ukrainian rescuers was Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky. And the way Andrei Sheptytsky spoke about rescue, what he said to his fellow Ukrainians was that he who loves his neighbor in this way will bring a blessing upon himself and upon his village. So, of course, what Sheptytsky is citing here is the parable of the Good Samaritan, in which a stranger helps a stranger, right? It's a very profound citation. And in the parable of the Good Samaritan, as you will all know, Jesus says, the discussion is about who is a neighbor, right? A neighbor is a very important word, and I think in these, because a neighbor may not be a friend, it may not be a family member, but the whole point in the parable of the Good Samaritan is, who is thy neighbor? Who is your neighbor? And Jesus' answer is, he that shows mercy is a neighbor. And then Jesus says, go and do likewise. Now, I cite all of this not because it's Sunday and not because I'm requiring you to go to church, but because this is what a Ukrainian rescuer is citing. And interestingly, Christians in Ukraine, in Poland, in Russia, and elsewhere, when asked why they rescued Jews, if they said anything, and very often they had nothing to say, which is interesting, they would say, it was normal, I was just doing what everyone else was doing. But if they cited anything, it was very often the idea of being a good neighbor. It was precisely this passage. So I cite this in Ukraine because it's a Ukrainian rescuer, it's a Ukrainian context. And in this citation, we have an idea of what it means to be a neighbor, but we also have an idea of what it means to be a nation. We should remember that Sheptytsky was also a nation builder. He was concerned about how nations would be. And this is my basic idea, that how you choose to remember is how you choose to become a nation. So if you choose to remember the Holocaust as simply a history of someone else, then you will not have an inclusive political nation. It becomes impossible. If you choose to remember the Holocaust as a history of interactions, where people behaved better or worse for reasons that we try to understand, then you have a chance at building a political nation. This doesn't apply only to you. It applies to Russia, it applies to Belarus, it applies to Lithuania, Poland, and it applies to France and to Germany. It applies to everyone. I think it applies to the United States. It applies to Canada. Right now in North America, we're talking about how we didn't take Jews in the 1930s, and how people in the 1930s in the United States or in Canada made the same kinds of arguments then that we're making about Syrians now, right? So we all have our failures, we all have our places of reflection. So it's in this way that the Holocaust is about Europe, right? Not because Europeans or Americans should come and tell you what to do, but because there is a certain idea of nationhood which involves reflection as opposed to myth-making. And the Holocaust is the primary example, I would say, of an occasion for reflection. Thank you.
Дякую, пане Снайдер. Шановні колеги, чи є питання або уточнення?
Do you have questions? Please ask.
Сергій Малярчук, Український кризовий медіа-центр, місто Тімі.
Ukraine Crisis Media Center, Сергій Малярчук.
It's not your first visit to Ukraine. Could you find the difference saying in a measure of 2 years when you've been here first time? I mean the difference in Ukraine itself, how we celebrating or commemorating this event. Thank you.
Okay. So I first came to Ukraine when some of the people in this room were not alive, right? I first came to, well, I think that's true. Maybe not. I came to Ukraine in 1993. Maybe you were very small. Some of you, I think, probably didn't exist. But I first came to Ukraine in 1993. And so let me start from there. In 1993, commemoration of this kind, I think, would have been unthinkable, right? And your question raises a very interesting point, because it raises a point I didn't about how we forget things, because how we remember is about the future, but it's also about addressing how we forget. And in the case of Babi Yar, there were several methods of forgetfulness. There was the Nazi method, which is that in 1943 the Germans forced Soviet prisoners of war to dig up the bodies. And then there was the Soviet method, where right from the beginning in the Soviet press, and even in Soviet reports within the administration, things that weren't published, you see that the word Jews is pushed aside and replaced with citizens, or if Jews are mentioned, it's always alongside other people, right? And there's a nationalist way of forgetting, which if you look at the Ukrainian nationalist press from October of 1941, that the nationalist idea is, yes, it happened, but they deserved it, so let's forget about it, right? And then, there's the Western way of forgetting, which we export to you, which is to say the Holocaust is about Auschwitz, so you should remember Auschwitz. There are all these ways of forgetting which conspired. So in 1993, insofar as there was a discussion about the Holocaust in Ukraine, it was being carried out by people who came from the West, who generally, as historians, knew very, very, very little. Or it was being carried out by people who were trying to return to the places where their family came from, and who knew the name of a village but didn't know the general context. But something like this that we were doing this year, I think, would have been more or less unthinkable. If you're asking about Ukraine in the last few years, I'll just repeat a point that I already made in a slightly different way. Civil society is always about the past. Whenever you see a functioning civil society, a part of that, not a big part, right? I'm a historian, so I'm always talking about history, and I understand that 99% of civil society is about the present, right? It's about the rule of law, it's about freedom of expression. But whenever there is civil society that functions and that matters, there are always a few people, usually with like beards, a few people who are concerned with history. There's always that, right? In Russia, there's Memorial, right? In Poland, there was Karta. Whenever there is functioning civil society, you always have some small part of it that's concerned about the truth of the past. And that's true in Ukraine today, right? Insofar as we are learning about the Holocaust in Ukraine, and we are, it's because you have a small group here, a small group there, people who are fanatical, really, who are publishing documents and then publishing analyses, right? So I take what we now know about Babi Yar to be a sign of the functioning of civil society in Ukraine. And we'll know if civil society goes away, we'll know it because the quality of historical work will go way down. That's how I look at it.
Дякую вам. Чи є ще запитання? Бачу, що є, будь ласка.
We have question.
Volodymyr Yermolenko, Hromadske TV. I have many questions to you, but I hope we'll talk later. Two first questions. The first, you show in your books, in Black Earth and in different texts, how basically these Holocausts were developing. That, for example, if Hitler did not invade Soviet Union, if he didn't had his own Ostpolitik, so probably Holocaust would have been avoided. So do you think it was inevitable initially in the Nazi worldview and in the way how Hitler himself expressed his Weltanschauung in Mein Kampf and other texts? And the second question, you also a kind of person who have shown brilliantly the way how Ukraine, Belarus, Eastern Poland were between these two totalitarian regimes, meaning bloodlands, of course. How would you compare Holodomor and Holocaust? In which ways they're similar and in which ways they're different?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the first question about the inevitability, in a way you've already answered in the question itself. I think it's certainly right that Hitler could imagine a world without Jews. It's in the first pages of Mein Kampf. The first pages of Mein Kampf describe the way the world should be without Jews. Without Jews, the strong races will rise, which is good. The weak races will be starved to death. This is also good. Competition, bloody competition, is the only good thing. So in what you're calling the Weltanschauung, Svitopohľad, I don't know. In the worldview, clearly Hitler can imagine that Jews are all going to be exterminated. And again, at the end of chapter 2, there's a passage in Mein Kampf at the end of chapter 2 where he says, unless the Jews are removed from the face of the earth, the human species will go extinct. Right? So he's very clear about that. And I think that's an important part of the story. And I disagree with historians who present the Holocaust as entirely a functional question, right? That said, we have to answer the very important question of how that worldview becomes reality. Because most of us have worldviews, and fortunately, we're not able to turn them into reality, right? I mean, I would like it if your worldview were turned into reality. But in general, like, we all have worldviews, but that doesn't mean we can turn them into reality. So a history of the Holocaust has to involve not just Hitler, but his party, how that party came to power in 1933, how that party transformed the German state, and then for me, and that's what other historians have done, and then for me, the important question then becomes how that party and that state destroy and transform other societies. That's the next step that I try to make in my own work. As far as comparing the Holodomor and the Holocaust, I should say that at the beginning, the question of comparison doesn't make me very excited. So there are some people who, for political motives, are very excited by comparison because they want to show that something was worse than something else. And then there are other people who are very excited that you should never compare anything because they're trying to preserve a certain national narrative, a certain closed national narrative, right? I don't belong to either of those groups. I find comparison unexciting. I'm happy to do it, but I just would like to first say that it's not an emotionally engaging exercise for me. That is to say, I think it's fine. I don't think there should be a taboo on it. But it's very important also that we don't motivate our historical inquiries by trying to show that something was worse than another. We have to motivate our historical inquiries by trying to establish the facts, and then we can make comparisons. Okay, so that said, let me tell you some of the things that I found in writing Bloodlands, which are maybe a little surprising. Before I wrote Bloodlands, there was the general idea that, on the one hand, the Holocaust was special because it was an attempt to kill everyone in a single group, but on the other hand, Soviet policies killed more people. It's not really true. So the Holodomor killed about the latest reliable estimates are about 3.8 million people. In the book I said 3.8 million people. And then the Great Terror killed about another million people. And then you can maybe find another million. But the Holocaust alone is almost 6 million people, right? And then the Germans killed 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, and they killed another 1 million people in retributions for partisan actions. So that actually the Germans killed more people than the Soviets, despite what pretty much everyone thinks. But and the reason I think that is because I'm basing myself on the numbers, right? I didn't really care who killed more. I was just interested in, what was actually the case. If you compare the specifics of the Holodomor to the Holocaust, certainly there are a couple of fundamental things that are the same. That in both cases you're dealing with a party state, so a state where it's the party rather than some neutral bureaucracy or democratic institutions that are in charge. And in both cases it's an ideological party, and in both cases the ideology identifies an enemy. In the case of the Nazis, the main enemy is the Jews. In the case of Leninism in the early 1930s, the main enemy is the peasants or the kulaks, right? And in both cases, policy decisions are taken to harm those groups. And in both cases, when policies don't go as planned, those groups are blamed even more. So Germany invades Eastern Europe partly in order to destroy Jews. And when the invasion fails, Jews are blamed and killed entirely, right? Stalin executes the 5-year plan partly to destroy the kulaks, and when the 5-year plan fails and there's hunger, he blames the kulaks and even more kulaks are killed. And he blames the Ukrainian nation, and Ukrainians suffer especially. So those are the similarities. What are the differences? The main difference would be that the Holocaust was an attempt to exterminate everyone. I'm just going to say what everyone knows. The Holocaust was an attempt to exterminate all Jews under German control, whereas the Holodomor was an attempt to punish people on the territory of Ukraine. But it was not an attempt to kill every last Ukrainian. And that's a difference. Now, when I say that, I'm not trying to minimize the Holodomor, right? I mean, in my view, the people in the West, and even in Ukraine, now tend not to understand just how horrifying a starvation of millions of people is. Not only what it does to the people who are starved to death, but what it does to the people who survive, who observe it, and in some measure are taking part in it, right? Just the social horror of that, I think, is not really understood. So just returning to comparison, what I really don't like about comparison is when people end up by saying this was better and that this was worse than this, and therefore we can forget about this, right? I'm not of that school at all. I think we have to remember the Holocaust as it was, and remember the Holodomor as it was. And in both cases, the terrors are generally much worse than we remember.
Дякую. Ще є питання, будь ласка, представляйтесь.
I wonder if you could offer some reflections on the centrality of Ukraine. In your writing, you treat Ukraine as central in the minds of Hitler, in the minds of Stalin, a key element in the war. Mm-hmm. As we commemorate this 70th anniversary of Babi Yar, there's a sense in which Ukraine is central for the present and the future in Central and Eastern Europe, the ways in which we remember. So I'd welcome your reflection on looking back and looking forward in terms of Ukraine's centrality.
Okay. So in my remarks at the beginning, I talked about facts and ideals. In my answer to your question, I'm going to try to make a similar point, but on the basis of a much harder and cooler geopolitical analysis. There have been 2 Europes that have more or less succeeded. That is, 2 Europes which have had some kind of duration and brought some kind of prosperity. There was a Europe of empires, and then there was a Europe of integration. There haven't really been any other Europes. So there's a Europe of nation states, but the Europe of nation states was a bit of a disaster, and it persists largely in our minds and in the school books that we're forced to read or Europeans are forced to read as children. The way history actually works is that you have a period of imperial colonization, whether that's the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the English, going out into the oceans and establishing maritime colonies, or whether it's the Russians, the Habsburgs, the Prussians establishing colonies in Eastern Europe, right? But that's history. There is no history of the nation state there. It's the history of empires. The history of empires comes to its bloody climax precisely in Ukraine, because after the First World War, or when the entire world is already covered by empire, essentially, both Stalin and Hitler look at Ukraine as a colonial territory, following different ideologies, but in some ways very similarly. For Hitler, Ukraine is what he calls Lebensraum, and Ukrainians are Africans, and he and other Nazis express themselves in a very vulgar way, which I won't repeat, about Ukrainians, making comparisons to Africans. And during the German occupation of Ukraine, that same language was racial language about Ukraine, making comparisons to Africa, right? Whereas what Stalin was doing, following not a racial but a class analysis, was to say that Ukraine, we the Soviet Union, says Stalin, have to have internal colonization. We have to make an empire of ourselves. We have to colonize ourselves, which means we have to take the territories which are especially fertile and exploit them to build cities, to build factories, and so on. And that means Ukraine has to be exploited to construct the Soviet Union as a whole. So in my view, that's the last stage of imperial European history, and the confrontation between the German armies and the Soviet armies in Ukraine in the Second World War is the last great imperial war. Okay, and so imperialism, if you like, ends in the Second World War with this horrible European catastrophe. Now, what is the European Union? What is the European Union? Is where you go with your imperial hangover. What's hangover in Ukrainian? I've forgotten. Is it kots? What's Ukrainian? What's hangover in Ukrainian? Right, thank you. So you have an empire and you lose your empire. Where do you go, right? You go to the European Union, always. This is what the European Union is a way of talking about, it's a way of not talking about how you lost an empire, okay? What the West Europeans say is, there was a Second World War, it was very bad, we learned from it. Not true. Okay, there was a Second World War, it was very bad, but they didn't learn anything from it. What they learned from was their lost colonial wars in Indonesia or Indochina, right, in North Africa. When they lost colonial wars, then they went to the European Union, okay? And this is true of the Germans, because the German colonial war was the war to conquer Ukraine in 1941. When they lost that war, then, okay, in 1945, 46, 47, 48, they have the idea of European integration. Wonderful. But European integration is where you go when you realize that empire is no longer possible. And then you make up a nice story about how you don't like war, and then you tell the Americans how nice you are, right? That's the next step. But the reality is that European integration is where you go after empire. That's true in Western Europe. After 1989, it's true in a different way for Eastern Europe. After 1989, places like Poland or the Czechs, the Slovaks, who had been part of the post-war Soviet empire, also have a place to go. And as I see it, the miracle of the European Union is that it unites countries which used to have big empires with countries that used to be small parts of somebody else's empire. And everyone says these places are equal, right? That's for me a kind of miracle, right? That's for me the miracle of the European Union. So when you ask about the significance of Ukraine, I'm not trying to enter this geopolitically. Ukraine is a test of whether an internal part of the Soviet Empire, the part that, maybe along with Kazakhstan, but the part that was arguably most exploited imperially in the Soviet system, can move into the European system, right? And building the nation state, building the state is not an end in itself. Building a state is part of how you become European. Like, that's what you have to do to become European. So if for Ukraine to succeed as a state, there has to be some kind of Europe there to receive it. On the other hand, I think it works both ways. If Europe also needs Ukraine, because the whole process of European integration depends upon Europe being attractive. And that means Europe has to draw in people on its borders. It's not that the Europeans want to do this. It's just the nature of the project. People always talk about the European Union enlarging. The European Union never enlarges. The European Union is pulled outward by societies who desperately want to get in, right? The European Union did not want to admit Poland. It did not want to admit Hungary. It did not want to admit the Baltics. It was more or less forced to by the reform processes and by the insistent politicians of those countries, right? So the European Union needs to enlarge. It needs to be attractive in order to exist. And Ukraine as a state needs some kind of European process if it's to be a state. Because, and this is where this is a very important point. And I mean, it relates to things that people say in Russia, but also now in London, right? And in France. You cannot make it, no one can make it as a nation state. It can't be done. Even the Germans couldn't do it. If the Germans can't do it, nobody can do it, right? I mean, America, yes, maybe, right? America, maybe. China, maybe. But no European state can make it as a nation state. And so the Ukrainian question is a central question for Europe. Can Europe continue to survive, continue to enlarge?
Дякую. У нас є ще запитання.
Ольга Вакала, Запорізька філія НТКУ. Пане Тімоті.
Mr. Timothy, thank you for your fundamental description, understanding of Holocaust, where you are talking about ideology and no lawlessness, and parallel with our eastern neighbor appearance of Putin in Russia and the appearance of Trump in the USA. Is this historical coincidence?
And let me try to give you a few answers before I talk about our beloved presidential candidate. The point that you make about statelessness, right? I tried to make the point about statelessness. What did you call it? Bezzakonia. In 2013, 2014, I tried to point out, writing in English for a Western audience, why it matters so much that Putin, Lavrov are saying that the Ukrainian state doesn't exist, right? When Putin says in April of 2014 that treaties with Ukraine no longer apply because Ukraine as an entity has ceased to exist, this has profound meaning. I mean, meaning that goes beyond just disrupting the European order, because it refers us back to the 1930s. And this is what I was trying to say. And other people, I mean, Andrei Zubov was trying to say something similar. It's not that it's exactly like Anschluss or exactly like Munich, but the notion, when one European state says that another European state doesn't exist, that's the beginning of something awful, right? And of course, in the history of the Donbass, it was the beginning of something awful. Russia is a repressive country. But if you want to look at where Russia has actually caused direct human suffering on a large scale, it's in southeastern Ukraine, Crimea too, but southeastern Ukraine, where at least 10,000 people have been killed, roughly 2 million people have been displaced, and that's because of this ideology. I mean, because of this ideology of statelessness, right? It's not the only reason, but it's part of the reason. Making the connection between Putin and Trump, I would start with something more fundamental, which is this world of post-factuality, or as I would say in the Russian case, non-factuality, because I'm not sure when the factual stage was, but this world of non-factuality, which, you know what I mean, where in politics, it's no longer important to even pretend to tell the truth, where in politics just becomes a kind of projection of useful fictions, right? So, the presidential campaign in the United States has been very interesting because we have one, very boring, very empirical candidate who tends to say things that are more or less true, And then we have a second candidate who is post-factual in this way. Who, I mean, it's not just that he's a racist and a xenophobe and a narcissist and a generally horrible human being. It's also that he projects fiction, right, all the time. He hurls fictions at people and then forces them to react to that. So there are two different epistemic styles. And in a way that makes the American elections an interesting test for something which is happening in the West in general, right? Because this post-factuality or non-factuality was also on display in the Brexit referendum. And the post-factuality or non-factuality has won in Russia, right? It's won. I mean, it's going to be a long time before, I mean, there are wonderful journalists in Russia, right? And I read them, and, you know, but the dominant tone is a non-factual tone in the media and in politics. And so I see this as a general Western phenomenon, right? I don't see it as, I don't think the Russians are any different, particularly from the Americans. You know, I think we're just as vulnerable to this stuff as they are. And I've been saying this, you know, for a long time now. You know, and Peter Pomerantsev, in his wonderful book about Russia, closes, which is about the Russian media, closes it with the remark, there is going to be here, or here is going to be there. In other words, what's happening in Russia is part of a general civilizational transformation which Americans and the British should be worried about. He's absolutely right. So the thing about post-factuality is that it's not innocent, right? I think it's closely connected to the return of fascism, which is, those are two words that people don't usually use together. When people say post-factuality, they're usually thinking postmodern. And once you say postmodern, it's like you're talking about French literary theorists. And once you're talking about French literary theorists, then you think about cafes and croissants and short skirts, and it all seems harmless, right? But when we say post-factuality, we should actually be thinking about fascism. Because fascism begins from the claim that there isn't really empirical reality, there isn't really progress through time, life is all about will and projection and spectacle, right? So as I look out upon the world, you know, I see a connection between this thing we think of as postmodern, this post-factuality, and this thing which was modern, which was fascism. And I think it's no coincidence that, for example, people in Russia who are very sophisticated and look postmodern are also the same people who cite Russian fascists. Right, so that's something, and I think it's no coincidence that Donald Trump, who is very postmodern in this way, who is a television personality, right? He's not a successful businessman. Okay, he probably doesn't have any money. We don't know, but my guess is he doesn't have very much. What he is a television personality. He knows how to talk to a camera, right? And I think it's no coincidence that someone who is post-factual is also someone who says horribly racist things, talks about building walls, uses various anti-Semitic gestures. I think that's not a coincidence. I think these things fit together. So when you ask about Putin and Trump, I think they both, I mean, there are connections between the two, right? Trump loves Putin. Trump loves Putin. He wants to be like Putin, right? He clearly admires the man. Putin, because he thinks that Putin is like Trump, but only more so. You know, because Putin actually has money and power, and you know, and has this amazing media apparatus to project his fictions. So he admires Putin. He wants to be like Putin, which of course is a terrifying prospect for the United States of America, right? But it's not just that. There are other connections too, like that go through Ukraine, right? So that Paul Manafort who was Yanukovych's main political technologist, was also Trump's main political technologist. There are other connections like that, and they're real, and they're also frightening. But for me, there's also a resemblance, because there's a general phenomenon, you know, which is a tilt towards the far right, which looks like, culturally, it looks like it's very progressive because it's all postmodern. But in fact, it's a tilt towards the far right.
Чи ще запитання, колеги?
Are there any questions in the audience? There are no questions. Thank you, dear friends. We wish you every success. Thank you.